Okay, beat all the games. What now? Ooh. Good evening, and welcome to another edition of The Boogeyman. Today we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite ubiquitous movie watching, TV watching app. We're going to be talking about the top 11 of my favorite horror movies that are currently on Netflix. On top of this list, we have on number 11... we have Terminator 2. Now, I know I might get into a little bit of slack for calling Terminator 2 a horror movie. Some people might not define it as a horror movie. There's nothing really supernatural about it. There's nothing really horrific per se. But I actually think when you think of the iconic image of, you know, the Terminator with the flesh ripped off and the machinery underneath, it's a fairly iconic horror image. When you think of the T-1000 with his metal sword arm things, you think of, you know, blood and guts. And it's not necessarily a bloody and gutty sort of movie, but I think the iconography is still recognizable enough to be considered a part of the horror genre. The Terminator series in general has gotten a lot of slack, especially with recent films. T3 is probably the worst film ever. But people seem to forget that the original two were actually some of the most interesting sci-fi horror that was released at the time. Now, the first two Terminator films are definitely my favorite, and of the two, Terminator 2 is definitely the most interesting. It kind of rehashes a little bit of the mythology that they created in the first one and made it a little bit more interesting, raised the stakes. Of course, you have the apocalypse coming. Skynet, it's just going to mess everything up. Now, when I think of Terminator 2, I think of the relationship with John Connor and the Terminator Protector in Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, at the time, of course, Arnold was well known in the first film for being the badass murder machine. So when he appeared in Terminator 2 as the Protector, it was a very interesting flip of the script. And you had this interesting kind of Injustice-style gods against God with the Terminators fighting against each other. That was just kind of interesting, and it was really kind of a nice subtle revision to the genre, where you have monster against monster. It's very Godzilla-esque, where you have one battling to be the king of the, in this case, Terminator monsters. Now, I'd recommend Terminator 2 with a caution that it is a lot more action than it is horror, but there's elements of horror in it as well. Of course, we have the apocalyptic end-of-the-world visions that Sarah Connor has throughout the film. We have very terrific, cold, calculated killers that are the antagonists. And we have just Terminator working at its best here, with a threat that's very visceral and real. The T-1000, played by Robert Patrick in this film, is a very cold, calculated, just don't give a shit monster that'll just mess you up to get where he's going. He doesn't care who's in his way, what's in his way. Between him and his goal, he's just going to just plow right through it. In fact, he does with a semi at one point, which is awesome! So yeah, T2.
Number 10.
Number 10 is a little bit of a guilty pleasure, admittedly. It's a little film called Dead Snow, Red vs. Dead. Me and a friend of mine watched this film when we were kind of half asleep. We wanted to watch some horror movies, wanted to watch something interesting. So we watched it quite late at night. I think it was at like 2 a.m. We just kind of were disappointed with the horror movies we had watched up to that point, and I kind of needed my fix, so I convinced my friend to watch this film that I was kind of on the fence with, but it was on Netflix, so I figured, what the hell? So I clicked it, and I didn't regret it because it was hilarious from beginning to end. It's one of those films that has such a dark humor, you never really know whether they're intending to be just psychotic or funny, but they kind of end up being both, and that's kind of my favorite mix of things, is when there's this just chaotic energy throughout the film. I won't spoil too much, but suffice to say, when a car gets stuck, the solution to a car getting stuck in the mud scene, my God, that was the funniest thing I think I've seen in years. It was hilarious, good time. Very much so a guilty pleasure. It's not Shakespeare by any stretch of the imagination. You won't go through emotional turmoil in this movie, but what you will do is get some interesting creature effects, some interesting revisionist World War II sort of battle reenactments with zombies, which is just a whole mix of things that you wouldn't think would work well together, but they really do. And I just recommend it for those days when you just want something high octane with a lot of fun and a lot of craziness and zaniness. It's definitely one of those films. Number 9, again, like Terminator 2, is kind of a little bit of a stretch of the horror genre, but it is definitely one that I thoroughly enjoy, which was Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. It's a relatively new film in the Apes mythology, but one I think took an interesting stance, portraying kind of the beginning of the end. And it did it in a very somber way, whereas a lot of the other films, especially Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes film, didn't go. It avoided any sort of kitschy, cheesy comedy, or even the weird ending that Tim Burton will just, what the hell were you thinking, man? Just will never live up. And kind of just really struck me as surprising in the respect that it really allowed a lot of emotion, a lot of seriousness, a lot of humanity, especially in this apocalyptic kind of scenario where you have humanity fighting to keep its dominance or its survival on the planet, and you have another group, basically another tribe of animals trying to do the same. And it questions a lot of humanity's choices in a way that I think is interesting and makes it kind of hit home that, you know, we don't necessarily treat the natural world in the way we should, or even each other as the way we should. It kind of questions whether humanity is inherently evil, or whether there's just some sort of corruption that is just inherent in any social species. Which I think was an interesting take, and I really recommend it. It's definitely more of a thinking man's film than I thought it would be. It's definitely an action flick to a degree, but it has a lot of meat for the thinking man as well, so I highly recommend it. The reason I classify it as a horror is there's a lot of this post-apocalyptic, very interesting imagery of this kind of forest world that the apes are living in, and this very makeshift steampunk duct taped together world that the humans are existing in, and it's kind of this interesting take on it. It's worth a watch. It's worth a watch. Watch it.
Number 8.
Number 8 is another one of those revisionist films. I mentioned revisionism in passing, but this is definitely a revisionist film about the very ubiquitous zombie genre. Now, Contracted is definitely a film that has pacing issues, much like a lot of independent films, but it is an interesting take on the genesis of the zombie issue, the zombie trope. One that kind of makes it into this STD thing that's carried along, and I won't spoil too much, but it's passed on in a very icky, gross sort of way. And I wouldn't call it a thinking man's film, because it's basically the premise is what carries the film throughout, but it's this take on watching the zombie as a person becomes a zombie from beginning to end. A little bit like what they did in Warm Bodies, but in this one it's a lot darker, a lot more serious, and a lot more grotesque. It's been compared to a film that I quite enjoyed, which kind of has a similar idea, but the thing that makes Contracted a lot more interesting, and especially a lot more highly recommended for me personally, is that it's a lot more cohesive, it's a lot less experimental, it's a very straightforward story. Girl meets boy, girl catches zombie STD, girl slowly starts to fall apart. Pretty straightforward stuff. Highly recommend it for anyone who is interested in a little bit of gooiness, but not so much that it's hardcore. I wouldn't consider this film a hardcore film by any stretch, but it's definitely an interesting take on the zombie mythology that happened a little bit before I got sick of the genre, so I actually do have a little bit of fondness for it. But just please, no more zombie films. We're good.
Number 7.
Number 7 is a very traditional, classic horror film that kind of has a lot of gothic tropes, haunted creature, phantom attached to the haunted house, and it's a film called The Conjuring. I quite liked The Conjuring. There's the elements of kind of faux reality, where they talk about how it's based on real-life paranormal investigators. Of course, I don't really believe too much in the paranormal, but it's fun to play around with that. What if this stuff is all real? Sort of idea that worked quite well for the Blair Witch. Quite well, and works quite well for this film for different reasons. The Conjuring definitely brings back this old mentality of the creepy house, very creepy imagery, and just kind of getting under your skin in a ghost story sort of way that I quite enjoyed, quite like. It's definitely one of those films that rewards horror fans for all these familiar type of tropes. It doesn't really do much original, but it's a nice slow burn and a very familiar sort of territory, especially to horror fans.
Number 666.
Metal. So number 6 is a little film called 13 Sins. It has one of my favorite actors, Ron Perlman, whose voice has so much bass that he ruins one of my friend's TV every time we try to watch something randoky. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So Ron Perlman stars in this film as a detective. He's sort of a supporting character. It's an interesting take. It's very original in the respect that it follows a guy who gets offered pretty much everything. It's a very Faustian sort of tale. He gets offered anything he wants. All he has to do is begin a game show by killing a fly in his car, and that's the one sin he begins with. And then, of course, in expected fashion, the sins he's asked to do become more and more disturbing, more and more violent, more and more vile in nature, until the 13th sin, which, of course, is the most disturbing out of them all. And you're not going to get a spoiler from me. I don't care how much you beg. You're not going to get it. Watch the movie. It's a good movie. It's very independent, and it kind of wears its budget on its sleeve. But it's acted with heart, it's made with heart, and it has a very interesting premise that I haven't really seen very many movies like this. There hasn't been a whole lot of Faustian legends told in cinematic way in recent history, at least not that I can think of. Comment below if you disagree and have a whole slew of Faustian movies that came out in recent times, in which case I will adore you for that, because I love that type of story. But yeah, 13 Sins, number 6, check it out. It's a good friggin' movie. It's a good movie, oh yeah, you betcha.
Number 5.
Number 5 is much like Dead Snow. It's a little bit of a guilty pleasure, but one I thought was a little bit more accessible to the general populace, which is why it's a little higher on the list. And that's Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Again, it sort of revises the horror perspective and kind of tells the traditional teenage slasher flick from, I guess, the bad guy's perspective in a way that makes them not really that bad. It makes them just kind of accidentally goofy.
Oh, it's some pancakes. You hate pancakes. I'm going to make you something else.
And lovable, and they got 13 bears in their fridge, and, you know, they're yours. You'll get it when you watch the movie, so watch the movie. Just watch it already. The interesting thing about Tucker and Dale is that it kind of walks a thin line between silly and just actually comedic. And it walks that line very well, very deftly. I think the ending, it kind of loses a little bit of steam and becomes a little bit silly. But up until then, it's actually kind of an interesting take, and one that you can kind of take seriously enough to be engaged in these horrific things that are happening around this adorable, lovable redneck group of friends. So grab a beer and crack open a cola. So yeah, definitely check that one out.
Number 4.
Is yet again another revisionist film. It's a little bit of a motif, I guess. I really like films that revise and shift and update perspective on the genre, and that is Cabin in the Woods. This is very much so a love letter to horror fans. It basically discusses all of the familiar tropes of horror in a way, but also just kind of references them as well. Anyone who's well versed in horror will recognize a lot of the creatures that come up. Anyone who's not well versed in horror, well, it's just a fun teenage drama about these group of kids that encounter forces far beyond their imagining. And for those who just don't like teenagers, it's a fun sci-fi romp that just kind of blends the lines between sci-fi and horror in an interesting way that I think is just interesting. And I've never seen a film quite do as much successfully as Cabin in the Woods. Usually when you have a film that adds all of these elements in kind of a stew. Usually there's just too much. You know, there's the typical Spider-Man 3, just too much to even pay attention to. There's just all kinds of... just doesn't work. But in this case, it actually does. I got to give credit to the writers and the writer and director of Cabin in the Woods. Both of them made a film that really meshes a lot of different things in a way where it just doesn't distract. It just makes it so that you kind of don't know what to expect until you see the end. And especially for me, watching a film and not knowing what to expect till the end is not an easy feat for writers to accomplish. So I got to give them credit where credit is due. I didn't know where they were going with it. I got a little confused at first, and in a good way, because I just didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what I was going to see next, and I loved everything that they delivered. Highly recommended, especially to horror fans, but it's kind of one of those films that you don't really need to be a horror fan to enjoy. You just need to be a fan of fun, creative, original type of movies. So yeah, check that one out as well, eh?
Number 3
is one of those films that has nothing original, doesn't really surprise in any way, shape, or form, but somehow still delivers. I'm looking at you, Sinister. I knew every jump scare, it was telegraphed well in advance, but somehow all of the elements just work together in a way that just works. I'm not sure exactly how they managed to keep the tone with such a predictable, transparent story, but they really managed to do everything they need to do to get the audience engaged in a very primal, basic, we know what we're expecting, but that's exactly why we are kind of frightened by what we're going to see next sort of way. Horror fans might have mixed feelings about this film because of that unoriginality. I personally liked the fact that they could play with all of these cliches in a way that is telegraphed, obvious, and still effective in creating this really dark atmosphere that just permeates throughout the entire film. So it's definitely on my recommended list. It's number 3, so you know it has to be good. So why aren't you watching it? Well, watch this video and then watch, after you finish this video, watch Sinister.
Number 2
Number 2 is a film that is definitely close to my heart. Definitely achieved everything the filmmakers were going for. And I just adore it in every way, shape, or form. That's why it's number 2 and not in the lower on the list. And that is VHS 2.
What the fuck is that? Holy shit.
Did you hear that?
There's not enough good things I can say about this film. It's a found footage film, but it's a found footage film at the cusp of when that was starting to get a little bit cliched. They did it well. They did it interesting. They did it in a way that has a very calculated structure, a very kind of traditional anthology structure, which is one of my favorite structures of a horror film. Is when if you can do the campfire tales motif, where it's a bunch of little stories sewn together. You had me at that right then and there. You had me at campfire tales. I love that structure. They do it well. They do a wraparound story about these haunted VHS tapes. If you haven't seen it, it's very iconographic. It explains loosely why all of these stories are getting told in a very disjointed way, but it's enough to kind of put you in this mindset of these very forbidden sort of tales. And I like that forbidden aspect of it. It's a very transgressive sort of idea that we're not supposed to see these videos because they could lead to, you know, all kinds of chaos. One of the things I think VHS 2 does a lot better than its predecessor VHS 1, or just VHS as it's called, is that it solves the problem of pacing, which kind of had a huge issue in the first film. The first film kind of goes up and down when it comes to pacing. It has some very high octane moments with some very subtle, almost at times lazy sort of slower burns. Whereas VHS 2, it feels like they picked their stories with this overarching arc a lot more in mind. They don't necessarily have anything directly to do with each other, but they definitely have a lot more of a consistent pacing throughout, and the film is much stronger for that. It's definitely a film for those who love anthology tales, campfire tale type stories, where you have a lot of short stories with a wraparound. And again, as a child of the 80s, in which they were just all over the place. I don't want to use the word ubiquitous a third time. It's just too much. Or did I? Did I just do that? So yeah, it was definitely a big thing in the 80s to have these anthology tales, the Tales from the Crypt type stories, or what have you. And this film definitely plays with that well, updates it to a very modern context, ironically for being a film about these haunted VHS cassettes that half the people of our current generation have never seen, have never got them stuck in when they're just terrible. I'm very glad that I've seen the digital revolution. Anyways, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting film, definitely a fun film, definitely a dark film, which is definitely a pro in my books. So yeah, definitely check it out again after you watch this video first.
Number 1.
Number 1, I know I said I got annoyed with the zombie genre, but this film does something incredibly interesting and fun and makes it a bit of a mix mash of other things, and that's Wormwood. I love this film so much. So Wormwood is a very traditional, at least on the surface, tale of zombie apocalypse coming, and it kind of has this pseudo-religious sort of explanation for the beginning of the end. But what makes Wormwood interesting, it has a very Mad Max type feel to it, where you have these duct taped together cars due to a complication with fuel that arises in the story. I won't spoil too much, but they have some interesting solutions to that, and it just makes it a wild ride. It also is not a film that takes itself too seriously. It approaches some interesting emotional moments, but it also has a high level of humor and fun and chaos, and like I said, I love it when they have that sort of, is it funny or is it psychotic or is it maybe a little bit of both dichotomy, and this film definitely has that. It's a fun ride from beginning to end. Car guys will love it, horror movie guys will love it, romantic comedy people might not like it, but I still recommend it if you are on this list. Obviously, you're looking for the top 11 horror films on Netflix. And Wormwood actually came in a little later on while I was writing this list. It was originally going to be a top 10, and I do apologize for the odd number. Who does a top 11? But once I seen it, I knew it had to be on this list because it's definitely a fun ride. It's a little bit of a guilty pleasure, but my God, it's a fun guilty pleasure, and I definitely highly recommend it for that, and you won't be sorry. So there you have it. There's my top 11 picks of the greatest horror that are currently on Netflix. I did a lot of digging for you guys. I didn't do TV series specifically. That might be on a future list. But these are the top 11 films that I felt every horror fan should watch at one point in their life. There are probably some other films that are on there that are great, and I'm sure everybody has their own subjective list, but that's just my personal pick of the top 11 funnest horror movies, darkest horror movies, the ones that epitomize everything as great about the horror genre. And if you spend a quiet day watching all of these 11 films, you could be doing worse. You could be doing worse. Yeah, there we have it. Those are my picks. You should go watch them. And this is the Boogeyman saying, don't be afraid of anything. Not even me. Diddle.